can bring in our good friend, Genevieve. How are you?
I'm well. How are you?
I am good. We are going to be talking about suicide. Thank you, Jenny, for brave and coming on and talking with us today since it impacted life. I want to do a quick plug because I like to plug. There's an amazing book out
there. You're awesome.
It's called I Fight for Understanding. It is an amazing book, 31 Days of Caring for Huntington's Disease. This was composed by Jenny, and it is a fantastic book. Help for HD, you can get this on Amazon. All proceeds go to our relief fund. And we also are constantly giving this book out. She touches on things that are not talked about. So this is an incredible resource. It'll be one of our giveaways, and it is available. Can you talk about your other book and how people can get it?
Okay, so my other book you can find on Amazon. It's called What's Wrong with Emma. I actually dedicated this book to Megan. One of the things that they were having trouble with is her being included in things. These children are starting out normal and they're in a wheelchair and they start getting left out of things. So this book came to mind for me to write because I just was very moved by that. I have a 2.5-year-old granddaughter who is at risk. So my boys are gene positive. That fear is always in the back head. And so I wanted to be able to teach little children, their friends, families, that's still a little person to be included. So that's why I wrote that book, and Megan is so adorable. And so, yeah, that's my plug, and you can find it on Amazon.
All right, so let's tell us a little bit about yourself and your relationship with HD.
So I've actually been a caregiver for 2 people. I'm a registered nurse. I'm also certified in Huntington's disease. I started in the month of May writing tips for every day of the month because May is Huntington's Awareness Month. And that kind of blossomed. You guys picked that up and published my book. But I took care of my mother-in-law in the end stages of Huntington's. And then I was also the caregiver to my ex-husband who chose to take his own life through suicide last year. I've got 2 sons that have tested positive, and I have 1 son that chooses not to disclose his results. I don't know if he's been tested or not. He would be at risk. My children at this point seem asymptomatic, but we also have, of one white lie, we have an entire family full of nieces and nephews and great nieces and nephews that are all at risk. A very huge family. So that's my background, and it became my mission to help other people.
Yeah, talk about suicide, and if we could talk about your personal kind of story.
So my mother-in-law died naturally from her Huntington's disease. We took care of her, and we had her in our home for an extended period of time. Towards the end, when she got to where she couldn't stand or anything, we did end up putting her in a home, and then we just went on the weekends to see her. Well, when my husband realized that that was going to be him someday, and his symptoms started, and it started to affect him. Like, he couldn't run his business. He was a workaholic, and he's a cabinet builder. And in construction, you really need all your skills. You know, you need your fine motor skills, you need your mathematics skills, your people skills. And he was starting to have too many aggressive outbursts. He was starting to make a lot of really poor decisions business-wise. He got into a lot of trouble. And I think for him, it was his way of controlling the outcome. I don't think in his mind he could bear the thought of being in a wheelchair, being in diapers. He watched me feed his mom and bathe his mom and change her diapers and sleep with her at night because I was afraid she'd aspirate on her own vomit. And so for him, and he used to always say, and here's a red flag you all need to watch for. He used to always say, you're not going to have to worry about that with me. I'm going to take care of things. He would always say that. I'm going to take care of things. And I would always put it in the back of my mind, okay, is he reaching out? Is he hinting that he's going to do something about it? But he would always say he would never let himself get to the point where his brother was, and he would never go through what his mom did. And his brother is still living and pretty severe. And I think it was unacceptable to him. He was too proud. So it was his way of controlling the issue. The stats on suicide are extremely high, and ironically, they're high among caregivers and the person with Huntington's disease. I was looking up just a study done in 2000 by Druce and Pincus, and at that, there was 5.7% people with HD that actually completed the task, which goes pretty hand in hand for caregivers as well. And then the suicide attempts was 27.6%. That means they only attempted once. Scott actually completed it on his third attempt. He had 2 other attempts. So that's the other thing that you need to be aware of too. If they're trying it and they're probably going to succeed eventually if you're not very diligent about keeping an eye on that.
Sure. So do you know when family is most like at risk, the members of your family are most at risk for suicide?
So that's kind of a catch-22 question, because immediately after testing, they're very high risk, especially if they test positive. That little window is an extremely high risk window. But ironically, so if they're caregiving for a parent with it and they know their own status, they're at risk, really high risk during that time too. But they're also, as the disease progresses, there's cognitive and behavioral things that play into that. So if they're non-compliant with medications, they become a little more at risk as they start progressing, especially if somewhat still independent, if that makes sense. Like if they're still able to dress themselves and drive, and they're thinking, this could be several years after diagnosis, especially if they are who is progressing slowly. Scott wasn't progressing really quickly. His mom progressed extremely quickly. He was progressing really slow, very subtle. So he had all this time to think about it. If there's someone progressing slowly, they're pretty aware for quite a while. Like he was fully aware that he was losing his skills. And he would sit and cry and you know, pour his heart out to me and tell me he'd just be him. He couldn't go through this. And when we had a granddaughter, I think that was the icing on the cake for him, because the day that they announced the pregnancy, I will never forget that day. We were all at dinner and my son and his girlfriend announced the pregnancy. You could have heard a pin drop. You know how normally you would have excitement and hugs and, you know, oh, congratulations. It wasn't that way for us. It was dead silence. I educated my children not to reproduce naturally because of the risk of passing it on. And, you know, oopses happen. And she's here for a reason. That moment was very defining because you could see it on his face. And it was guilt. He was terrified. He had lost total control. The very thing we wanted to prevent happened. You know, the very thing we wanted to avoid, passing it on in our family, no control over that. And he bore tremendous guilt. He talked about it every day, how he just couldn't, especially she's so cute and she's so funny and she's so smart. And I just think he couldn't bear the thought that she may go through what, you know, we are. As each one of our sons tested positive, I could see that more and more of him, because we weren't going to have children. We were going to adopt. And then we were lied to by my mother-in-law, the very woman I took care of. And she fibbed to us and said that she had been tested and that she tested negative.
Yeah.
Our first son was born in 87 and the second one born in 90. So based on lie, all of us went and had kids. And, you know, we thought we were in the clear. I didn't know enough about it in those days. So,
yeah.
So anyways, here we are.
Yeah. So you talked about some that your husband had said to you. What did you help other families of things, them being aware that this is happening and that their loved one is thinking about suicide?
They will either drop subtle hints like, I'm going to take care of it, or you're not going to have to worry about that, or I've got things under control. Or they will say, well, I'll just commit suicide. Some people will actually literally say it, or they'll be pretty verbal about it. They'll say, well, if I get to that point, I'll life. There are people that do that. But the subtle ones, the ones that withdraw, are the ones you really have to watch. The ones that are spending too much time in their own head, because they may not say anything. It may be subtler than that. They may quit going to family gatherings. You might notice something on their history, on their computer. Like my husband had Googled all kinds of ways to commit suicide. There was a whole list of them that he had done. And he would joke about stuff like that, which I don't find funny, but he would make little comments here and there. So those are little soft, subtle signs. Crying, if they're in their room and you hear crying and they haven't reached out to you, for that may be a sign that they're planning on doing something. Also, if they're real adamant about certain things in order in a very quick manner, and I'm not saying that you shouldn't, because that's something we should all be doing, is getting your ducks in a row beforehand, getting your DNRs, getting your POAs, getting all of that. That's super important. But they might be in a rush to do that. So watch for stuff like that. Non-compliance with medication. That's a huge one that for us. Scott was very proud, and he just thought we were trying to control him when he got suicidal, and I tried to give him something. He didn't want to take it. He was real paranoid about being controlled. So non-compliance is huge, because not willing to take something for the aggression, they may go act out.
I think this is very important for our community that are survivors from suicide. What advice can you give to advocate for this out there?
So try not to get emotional. So for me, that was a really huge thing, because I bore a tremendous amount of guilt for that. And so did my children, and really so did my own mom. From the beginning, before we knew Scott had Huntington's, he was very aggressive. He caused a lot of turmoil within our relationship. As you know, Huntington's families can go through. And so there was a lot of guilt involved I felt responsible, because I didn't, you get a little egotistical. You think, oh, I've that off. It's going to happen to us. I've talked him out of it, because we can talk really heart to heart about that and about the effects that it would have on our kids. And I always just had this impression that he thought about what I said, that he would be like, okay, you're right, that would impact our kids too much. But they cross where they're in such a dark spot. So for me as a caregiver, I had to go seek counseling. I do take something for depression. I make sure that I exercise days a week. But my biggest has come literally from the HD. And I've pulled back a little bit since Scott committed suicide. I won't lie. I just needed a break, because I'm going to go through it again, possibly 3 or 4 more times. So I back for a little while. Sharon was one of my biggest support systems. I have a couple of friends that I'm really close, and talking with them and able to vent. As you stated earlier, only HD families truly know. So I've got some friends actually across the world that I have been in communication with for over 20 years online. Pat Wolf is one of them. Sharon's one of them. Donna is one of them. And Tom Lister is one of them. Those are people that I have kept really close ties over the years, watched the whole battle play out. And for me, that was probably the best thing for me, is being in a support system. We have one, I heard you mention, is there any for caregivers? There's an HD caregiver site that we don't allow anyone that's at risk for Huntington's to be on. It is simply people who are not at risk or caregivers. And then that way it's a safe place to vent. So they're screened before they can join. And that can be found on Facebook. So that's a good support site too. Also, just belonging to grief groups. I belong to a grief group online, because grief is something you go tremendously when your loved one commits suicide. Mm-hmm. I can't even describe the amount of grief that you go through. And you go through those different phases of grief. The anger, you get mad at yourself, you think, what could I have done different? But for me, it's just important to talk about it, for one, therapy if you need it, and make sure that you are literally taking care of yourself as a survivor. Don't be afraid to share your story, because it may help somebody else.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a very dear friend of mine, and her son committed suicide. I went to the service, and husband, who is this amazing man, stood, let's just stop and talk about the elephant in the room. My son committed suicide, and I'm angry. And right. I thought that was so raw. And like that feeling he pushed out to the people. He was saying, he got up and he was expressing his emotions and his process and the grief there. What a brave man for knowing that's what he was feeling. I think that's a lot of confusion. Do you find that, like, why, if I would have done this, if I would have?
For me, it was really confusing, because he didn't leave a letter. He didn't say goodbye to anyone. He didn't make any preparation for the end. So not only were we trying to get through that he had committed suicide, but we were having to deal with all the stuff that you have to deal with after someone's death, you know, taking care of the body and the funeral arrangements and his last wishes. And we were just scrambling. If they don't leave an explanation to you, can be pretty hard to deal with. It's a burden.
You did say was your ex-husband. You guys were divorced, but
Yeah.
I was always at awe with you because I watched as the book progressed, all of our interactions through that and stuff. And I always thought it was so amazing that you were his team member. You were on his side and you stood by him. And because you knew HD best, you cared for his mother, right? You're a nurse,
Right.
and you stood by him and loved him through it. So,
Well, thank you. And there was reasons for that. I mean, there's a lot of sometimes with hunting, you can see your loved one better from any sense. So, and we were living together, you know, in the end time. So, but I chose to live separate from the last year of our youngest son's life. I wanted to have a normal life. He was getting suicidal. So I was really afraid that since he knew his dad had it, he had watched his grandma have it. I was afraid that he would act upon that himself and, you know, just a kid. So I wanted him to have a normal, his senior year to be happy and fun and have nothing to do with, I don't know how any of us would have survived if he would have committed suicide. And he was pretty close. I had to take him to therapy and get him on meds and everything. He had really down by that. And that's the other thing. People don't, caregivers, children will commit suicide because they're watching this and their childhood isn't normal. They don't get to have the normal everyday fun things. And so they can become suicidal just from the sheer impact that our families, so the burden of that.
Yeah, we need to talk about the family unit as a whole, right?
So it's a tidal wave effect with Huntington's disease.
Yes, absolutely. Well, any final thoughts?
I would just encourage people, you know, to call if they need to. I would also encourage people to Baker if they need to. If your loved one is severe and they are talking about suicide, sometimes you have to intervene and you do have to Baker up them and get them admitted so that you can get their meds lined out. So those are two things I would really encourage. I would also encourage you to have those hard heart-to-hearts as to what they want done afterwards in case they do follow through.
Thank you so much. Once again, I Fight for Understanding. She has her amazing book. I don't have a copy of that on me.
I have it. What's wrong with them?
These are great. They have great reviews and it's raw. It's the truth. It's the real story. So thank you for sharing that with us, Jenny.